As you create larger, more complex programs, you'll likely end up writing multiple functions. You might also start using JavaScript libraries or utility functions that other developers wrote in your applications. So it's possible that within a function, there might be a variable that uses the same name as a variable used elsewhere in your script. For example, you might write a script with a variable named age, but also have a function called getAge that has age variable inside it. Two different variables with the same name. What does JavaScript do in this case? Fortunately, JavaScript provides separate scopes for each function. That is, each function has its own self-contained space. And the variables created within that self-contained space don't interact with the variables created in another space or another function. Let's look at an example. To code along with me, first download the course folder from the link in the description below and open it with your favorite code editor. Here I'm using Visual Studio Code. From the course folder, open the exercise folder called JavaScript Functions. And then open the index.html file using Google Chrome. Here I also open the JavaScript console. In the index.html file, remember to link variable scope.js file. In the variable scope.js file, there's a small function named getAge. This function uses the value of the age variable to display a message in the console. Now outside the function, I'll define a variable also called age and store a different value in it. Let's say 35. If I call the getAge function now, the JavaScript engine jumps into the function, sets the age variable to 50, then displays the message I'm 50 in the console. I'll save the change, refresh the page, and the message I'm 50 displays in the console. But what happened to this age variable with the value of 35? To answer this question, I'll add another console.log method outside the function and pass it the same IM message with the age variable. I'll save the change, refresh the page. Notice how we get one message in the console says I'm 35 and another message says I'm 50. Now I'll call the getAge function one more time just below this console.log. Let's see what happens. I'll save the change, refresh the page. We get three messages. I'm 50, I'm 35, and I'm 50. In the script, there are two variables named age, and each has a different value. Each variable is defined in a different context or scope. And programming scope is the context in which values are visible or can be referenced. Earlier I mentioned that each function has its own self-contained space, and any variables created within that self-contained space cannot interact with variables created outside of that space. When you define a variable inside a function, for example, you can only use the variable within that function. In this case, there's the scope of the getAge function. The age variable defined inside the function lives inside this function only. You can't access or update the function variables from outside the function. This also means that functions do not have access to each other's scope. To better demonstrate, I'll create a second function by copying the getAge function and pasting a new function below it and name it getAgeTest. This time I'll set the value of the age variable to 60 and display the message. I'll also update this function called getAgeTest. I'll save the change, refresh the page, and in the console I'll get I'm 50, I'm 35, and are you 60? Function scope is one of the ways that JavaScript uses to protect variables from overriding each other. There's also a scope outside of a function. It's called Global Scope, and it's the scope where the other age variable lives. Any variables you create that are not contained inside a function are accessible in this larger space called Global Scope. In our script, whenever we call the getAge function, we are accessing the age variable that lives inside the function. So the console displays I'm 50. However, the console.log method outside the function references the age variable in the global scope, which is set to 35. The reason I mentioned that the global scope is a larger space is because function can access the global scope. In other words, you can update the value of a variable that's defined in the global scope from inside a function. This is usually not recommended, but I'll show you an example. If I remove the let keyword inside the getAge function, the program changed dramatically. Without let keyword, the function now reaches out to the global scope and accesses a variable named age. Once it accesses the variable, it updates its value to 50. Now the age variable in the global scope stores the number 50. The number 35 value has gone forever. I'll save the change. Refresh the page. Notice in the console we have 3 messages with the same age, 50. As you learned in the previous lectures, a const keyword protects the variable from being updated to a different value. So one safeguard to prevent this from happening is to define global variables that shouldn't change with the const keyword. In my variable scope.js file, I'll use const for this instead of let. I'll save the change. Refresh the page. Now the script doesn't run, and the console outputs an error and says, uncaught type error, assignment to constant variable. It's generally not recommended to access global variables from inside your functions. It makes keeping track of variables and debugging more difficult. Also, one of the main benefits of functions is that they're self-contained blocks of reusable functionality. So making a function dependent on global variables that lives in other parts of the script can make the function harder to reuse and more likely end up with unexpected behavior. So it's acceptable to use the same variable name inside of different functions as long as you use the let or const keyword to define the variable. Because the variable only exists inside that function. You might be wondering, why not just use different variable names everywhere and avoid any issues in the first place? Well, you always want to make sure your variable names are meaningful and accurate for the context in which they live. Because of the way Scope works, you don't need to worry about using the same names as long as they live in separate functions or scopes. And sometimes you might not have a choice for variable names. For example, if you are using a JavaScript library or helpful utility functions that other developers wrote, you might run into variables with the same name and you can't update those because the library expects those exact variable names. However, because those variables live within different scopes, they won't collide with any variables you might create.